All right, Chris Peeks here tonight. Back with my friend Chris for another one of our Civil War chats. Usually on a Friday night. I enjoy these very much. One of the most knowledgeable people I've ever met for Yankee history. Um, I know deep down he is a Confederate sympathizer, but
Good luck.
uh, we won't tell everybody that. But anyway, tonight we're going to discuss um, Lee's abandonment of the trenches at Petersburg. So Palm Sunday, his lines are broken in three places. He wires back to Richmond. Jefferson Davis is actually in church, I believe.
Hmm.
They give him the word that his line is broken in three places, leaking out a hole, and abandoned. Jefferson Davis leaves church with two aides, and I believe he wires back and asks him if he can hold for another day.
Yeah. Um, as memory serves, it's actually it's really wild. Just because I know this story, it's really fun. The breakthrough occurs on April the 1st, and that's the Battle of Five Forks, which was soon earned the name the Confederate Waterloo. This is where General Pickett's division is just shattered. Well, Pickett's
That's where he was at Shadbake, right?
That's right. That's right. And in fairness to Pickett, he really realistically he shouldn't have been there. But in fairness to Pickett, it was an acoustic shadow, which I'm sure everybody who's watching this knows. But just for those who don't, acoustic shadows are really interesting topographical phenomena that's more or less noted during the Civil War, and that's I'm going to explain layman's term. I'm not a geography teacher, but essentially, when you're in a valley, if the right conditions around that valley exist, sound essentially ricochets upwards and over uh, the position. So you could have a battle that could be heard for 10 miles around. You might be 500 yards away, but if you're in that acoustic shadow, the sound's bouncing right over you. If you were to walk up the hill, all of a sudden you'd be greeted with tremendous noise. But below the hill, you hear nothing. And there's no way, this was a fairly new phenomena. There's no way Pickett could have known this. The same thing happens to General Buell, actually, at the Battle of Perryville, which is why during the Battle of Perryville, his staffs, the staff of the generals fighting there, spend the entire battle trying to get Buell to understand that the battle for Kentucky is being fought, and he categorically refused to believe them. He misses the whole battle, which is one of the reasons the Union's so disorganized in that fight, because he couldn't hear it. And he kept saying, if there was a fight, I would be able to hear it. So it was a common problem.
I've heard
Um,
that.
anyway, so Pickett, yeah, he's at a Shadbake famously. Um, and when the Five Forks breaks, this I believe it's on April the 1st that the last descent, Lee will message Richmond and Davis. Davis is in church that day. Palm Sunday, as you mentioned. And he tells him, Richmond must be evacuated. And Davis will respond, can you hold for another 24 hours? And Lee, according to the story I know at least, Lee, when he reads this, he doesn't even respond. He just tears the paper up. It's at about this time that Walter Taylor, his most famous subordinate,
He's getting his papers together and stuff, right? Getting
yeah,
his
it's even better. So he's a lieutenant colonel at this point, and he rather sheepishly tells Lee that he was actually supposed to get married next week in Richmond. And under the circumstances, would it be possible for him to have leave for a couple of hours to go to Richmond to get married before the evacuation? And Lee just stares at him for like a
I
minute
heard that
straight,
he
and then
gave that just
go,
death stare at
yeah,
him.
yeah,
Just looked right through him.
yeah. But interestingly, after the death stare, it was okay, go. Like
It
almost
was,
at a certain level, Lee's recognizing, yeah, whatever, who cares? Go get married, dude.
and he caught back up with the army to surrender.
Yeah, no, and he returned in time. He caught up with the army, I think, like by the third, like he caught up. But um,
So, sorry.
no,
Lee, Lee,
that's my story. But
Lee gives us orders. We've got to abandon. I mean,
yes,
it's how. I mean, and this may be a difficult question for you to answer, but how difficult is this to you got single file line, you're abandoning trench after trench after trench, and then try to get out and get into some type of formation. I mean, it's got
yeah.
to take.
I'm going to talk in broad terms here because I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert in these things, but generally how it would go if you're making a retreat of this nature is you have to keep your front line fortified with infantry. Infantry can move quite quickly. Your first objective is to move the baggage trains and the artillery. So you're basically pulling that out, and then you start pulling out your reserves until at last you're pulling out your rear guard.
So you're fighting a rear guard action, holding it, trying to hold off the advancing
Essentially, yeah,
Union.
or just
Okay.
slow them down, right?
So yeah.
Because Lee's goal is to evacuate his army. Now, I don't know the specifics. I think Lee did order the retreat. Like it was a retreat. He chose the Appomattox River to follow in the hopes that he could reach Farmville and resupply his army. But yeah, it's basically a delaying action at that point.
Now, let me ask you a question, because I've heard this, which I believe is a myth, or just a story that's been told, because it was only mentioned in a cabinet meeting at once, in passing, about getting to North Carolina and linking up with Johnston. I believe that is just totally untrue for several reasons. I
Mhm.
believe that how do you communicate? How do you coordinate a location spot? You then you're going to be trapped between two armies. I think, in my opinion, Lee's goal was get his army out there, get resupplied, get some distance between him and Grant, and he would figure the rest out later.
Yeah, I don't think he had a clear plan. I personally have always assumed he was trying to consolidate with Johnston. But the truth is, I mean, to steal a phrase from James McPherson, when you get to 1865, Confederate strategy is a forlorn hope, right? Every Confederate strategy is a forlorn hope. And this was something I was alluding to, and we started talking earlier before I had to cancel because I had to head out. But William C. Davis, in his book Crucible of Command, which is a really interesting study of the relationships of Davis and Lee and Grant and Lincoln. I mean, as command studies go, I think I've been on and off reading Stephen Woodworth, Lee and Davis at War for years now. Take way too long to finish these things, but I think it's a bit better. Oh, you still there?
Yeah, I'm here. Did I go
Okay.
away?
No, yeah, but yeah, your pitch is fine.
Can you see me?
No, I just see a C.
Oh,
But
hold on. Oh, I must hit the wrong. Sorry, I had a text message come through. Go ahead.
yeah, when you're on the phone, if you have to exit for any reason, it's fine. Don't worry. So excuse me. Um, where was I going with this? In Crucible of Command, uh, there's a really interesting exchange or series of exchanges that Davis alludes to. That's William C. Davis, the author, not Confederate president, no relation. Um, but between Lee and Davis's cabinet, and then Lee and Davis himself. And Lee is approached, I think it's in very early 65, not long after assuming overall command of all Confederate forces, which was a meaningless position essentially at that point.
Well, I'd like to say it's meaningless too because Lee did not understand strategy as Grant understood strategy.
Yeah, he never performs it at that level. I would say in Lee's defense, he never really had the chance to. But
True.
yeah, he certainly doesn't. I mean, Grant's grasp of Grant's strategy was fantastic. I
Because I know
imagine
this.
Lee would have.
I think me and you talked about this the other day. That yeah, the last time that Grant had a masterful part of strategy. Lee had something about him. I guess you're born with that. Either the battles he lost, he knew the key objective of what to take
Yeah,
on the battlefield and
yeah,
where it was going to be
yeah.
lost. But
Which
anyway,
Grant
sorry to
and so did Grant. I think we tend to overlook Grant's capacity as a battlefield commander. But anyone who doubts that, I simply suggest they look at the Battle of Fort Donelson, which was bloody, which was brutal, but it also resulted in the capture of a Confederate army, and the liberation of the Tennessee River, which is the beginning of the Grand Mississippi campaigns. So I think we tend to get trapped in these kind of um, we sort of pigeonhole, I think, different historical figures within like certain contexts based on our preconception of them. Grant was very good at maneuver warfare too. Both were exceptional at it. But anyway, in my
So
opinion,
where's
for
Lee
number four.
headed? He's going across the Appomattox River. Is he trying to find a way to turn inward to get in the interior of the South?
Well, I mean, I think to agree with what you're saying earlier, while I do think he imagined affecting a juncture with Johnston, I don't think he had a solid plan because a solid plan, as you were alluding to, wasn't really possible. I mean, there really is no solid plan beyond what's strange is he doesn't take his opportunities earlier in the march to escape over the Appomattox River. He really takes his time crossing it, which allows Grant to corner him. And I don't know enough about the campaign to offer a satisfactory guess about why that is, but I think and I've never read it. I've only heard the secondhand. I have not read it yet. But Porter Alexander's memoirs, which are considered to be some of the best. Like really someday I have to read those.
I do too. I do too.
He if I recall, again, I'm getting the second hand. He openly wondered why Lee did not affect a crossing as fast as possible. But I think Lee only has survival on his mind. I mean, famously, he's going up and down the lines, literally telling the men, "I will get you boys out of this. I will get you boys out of this."
Urging his men on.
But to get back to what I was talking about earlier, in January, this is still during the siege. Lee is approached by the Assistant Secretary of War. I think even actually at this point, John C. Breckinridge, he was back to being Secretary of War. He's approached by, I think, Breckinridge as well and a few others. And they basically, if memory serves, and again, I'm extemporizing, so if I made a mistake, I apologize. But they essentially ask Lee, would you write to Jefferson Davis and tell him that we need to sue for peace? Because most of the Confederate government at this point is recognizing that this is a disaster, that the siege of Petersburg is endless. Lincoln has won re-election. Atlanta has fallen. Sherman is cutting a swath through Georgia and South Carolina, and we can do nothing to stop him. One of the best exchanges in the war, in my opinion, when Davis instructs General Beauregard to do what he would always. This is what Davis always said whenever the Federals were advancing. Pull back, consolidate your forces, attack their lines of communication. To which Beauregard responded, General Sherman has no lines of communication. That's what makes his advance so brilliant. So like they've got nothing. So Lee was essentially asked, look, could you try to, if he's going to listen to anyone, it's going to be you. Can you try to get him to see reason here? We need to get terms at this point. And what's interesting is Lee, from what I know, what I think Davis reports he did write something to this effect. That's William C. Davis writing. President Davis then apparently summoned Lee to Richmond, and nothing is known about the exchange. There's no minutes of the meeting. All that is known is when Lee returns, he was in a terrible mood. And the correspondence between Davis and Lee is frigid after that, entirely on Lee's part, singularly. Davis is as warm and affectionate as he always was to his favorite generals, but Lee is very formal at that point. And what William C. Davis infers happened here is Lee wrote to Davis saying, we need to seriously consider surrender. And Davis summoned him to give him the dressing down of his life. And Lee didn't forgive him. And years later, when they were commenting, when both men were commenting on the war, Davis said of Lee, essentially, he praises his brilliant generalship and then says, but I am most proud to say, I'm paraphrasing, but what I am most proud to say is that he is my friend. And Lee, when asked similarly about Davis, Lee's response is, under the circumstances, Davis was probably the best president we could have had, which is damning with fine praise. That is a very mean-spirited response. He's basically saying, yeah, Davis was a screw-up, but I don't know, who could you think of to be in charge? So there's a real coldness there on Lee's part. So I think Lee was advocating for surrender earlier, by the beginning of the year. And he'd be insane not to.
Well, see, I believe, and I could be totally wrong on this, and I'm going by the warrior ethos. You never quit. You never admit defeat. You never, he may have went, Breckinridge and them may have went to him and Lee, went along with it. But deep down, I don't think he ever wanted to give up. Because
sorry.
Case in point at Petersburg. I mean, he put his army on the move and he kept them going because a warrior just does not want to admit defeat.
But this is what I was trying to drive at with this. There was a point I was, no, it's okay. There's a point I was trying to, I'm very long-winded, so believe me, I get it. But just because Lee is advocating for negotiated peace doesn't mean that he is going to give up the basic principles of the military culture of 19th century America. And in that military culture, one of the things that really separated the US from Europe, and this often caused misunderstandings, was that civilian leadership was in charge of the state,
Exactly.
including the army, which means Lee does not believe he has the executive authority to surrender unless the following conditions are met. And these are the conditions which, I mean, these are the same conditions that famously, at the time, Colonel Wilder discussed with, I can't remember which Confederate general, but, or engagement off the top of my head, but I think it was, I can't remember who it was. But famously, Colonel Wilder, when he was surrounded at one point early in the war, back when he was only a regimental commander, there were no senior Union officers to ask advice for. So he actually asked the commanding Confederate general, I think this was during the Maryland campaign, asked him, hey, could you come over here so I could ask for some advice? And he basically, it's like, should I surrender? And it was a very cordial conversation, and the response he got is the response that pretty much summarizes the honor system, the honor code of the military cadre of officers, which is if the situation is hopeless, so further resistance will only result in the further effusion of blood, and if the sacrifice of your command will not materially benefit the rest of the army or the military campaign, then you are compelled in the name of humanity to surrender. However, if either of those conditions are not true, you are compelled by the honor code to continue fighting. And the third option, is to have authorization from civilian leadership. Now, this means Lee can approach Davis to request authorization to offer terms, or to encourage him to offer terms on behalf of the nation, without violating the principles of military honor, because the civilian authority has that right, and he has the right to surrender under the auspices of civilian control. Failing that, the only situation he can surrender in is if A, his army is surrounded to the point of hopelessness, and B, the annihilation of his army will not materially benefit the rest of the Confederate strategy, or war machine. And that's Appomattox. So he can't do it until Grant has him line, square, and column. And that's why even on the 9th of April, Lee will launch one last desperate offensive to open up the Richmond-Petersburg Road in one last mad dash effort to continue his retreat, because he has to. But at that point, despite the fact that he has over 28,000 effectives on paper, less than 8,000 actually fall into their ranks. And the attack is immediately headed off by the Army of the James after an initial success against a cavalry division. And it's hopeless. And that is the moment that Lee can write to Grant and say, okay, you mentioned really nice terms yesterday, and I very rudely turned you down. Would you still be willing to give me those?
That brings me to another interesting question I have for you. And I read this in a Civil War Times magazine. And, we've all heard the story of the Army of Northern Virginia outnumbered 150,000 to 25, desperately trying to get away. So I read this article, and they made some good points. At Sailor's Creek, Lee lost half his army, essentially.
Yes, of what was left.
They estimate that when Lee abandoned trenches at Petersburg, he had rounded up all of the home guard units.
Yeah.
Everybody that was available.
Commanded by Richard Yule, of all people, actually.
And it said that they believe now, historians believe, Lee had upwards, and this is including because all the desertions they had.
Yeah.
That he had upwards to 70,000 men.
Yep, that's the numbers I know. I just say about 60,000. That's just the numbers I know. But yes, I agree with that.
You agree with that?
100%.
A lot of people argue with me all the time, and I'm like, look, if he lost half his army at Sailor's Creek, that puts you at 50,000. There was deserting right and left. 60,000. Yeah. Okay.
So here's where it gets messy. This is a subject I'm fairly comfortable on. And I'm just going to plug another book right now. If this is something that's interesting to you, because I love this stuff. Anyone who's listening to this, first off, hope you're enjoying. Second, a really phenomenal book on this. One of my favorite Civil War historians, Elizabeth R. Veron, Appomattox: Victory, Defeat, and Slavery at the End of the Civil War. It's mostly, I mean, military and political history are the same thing. It does deal with this final campaign because this is relevant to the question. So, essentially, when it comes to the numbers are really tricky because the army is dissolving in real time, right? I'll just give you my understanding. Lee has around 60 to 70,000 troops. Grant, I mean, grants are tricky because in theory, excuse me, in theory, Grant has um, the Army of the Potomac. He has the independent Ninth Corps, which at this point had basically been merged back into the Army of the Potomac. So we'll just say the Army of the Potomac plus Ninth Corps. He has the 23rd Corps under Edward Orr, I think. He also has 4th Corps and 21st Corps which is the Army of the James. If memory serves, I get that wrong. Forgive me, but I think that was the Army of the James. So he basically is the Army of the James. He has Edward Orr's Corps, and he has third. I'm really struggling today. 2nd Corps, 5th Corps, and 6th Corps, the Army of the Potomac, and the 9th Corps, no longer under Burnside following the disaster at the crater. So he has a substantial army, but the thing is, he's just trying to pursue as fast as human. Oh, and Sheridan's Corps, and he's trying to pursue as fast as possible. So he doesn't have that entire army on Lee, right? For example, Weitzel's division isn't pursuing Lee; they're wresting control of Richmond, right?
Right.
And what he's doing is he's leading with the fastest forces he has, which is largely Sheridan's cavalry, trying to harass Lee. Because, okay, famously, we know the famous story that Lee considered guerrilla warfare. I don't think he really ever considered it seriously, and we can talk about this later if you want. I
Yeah,
also
I
don't
do
think
want to touch on
I
that.
don't think Jefferson Davis did either. But regardless, that didn't only occur to Lee. That idea occurred to Grant too. And Grant was genuinely concerned. What happens if Lee actually slips away again? So Grant is pursuing him with that celerity that Lincoln had prayed for since the beginning of the war. So he's not mobilizing his entire force. He's mobilizing what he has. Realistically, Veron estimates Grant probably had about 120,000 troops to bear on Lee's 60,000, which means he had the usual 2-to-1 advantage that the Union generally had against the Confederates, and a 2-to-1 advantage that had been easily nullified up until this point by the Confederates' extraordinary advantage in defensive warfare. What happens at Appomattox in that pursuit is we finally see the thing that, and this is where I kind of differ from actual published historians. We often get the trope there is no decisive battle and pursuit in the Civil War. I disagree. The decisive battle in the Eastern Theater is the Battle of Five Forks, followed by Third Petersburg, and then it's a pursuit along the Appomattox. Because when you're dealing with armies of this size, having one, drag, bang, smash, connive battle is not enough. You have to pursue and annihilate your opposing army. And Grant does that at Appomattox. It's exactly what happens, which is why Lee's army is dissolving in real time. Where it gets tricky is 60,000. Then he loses a catastrophic number at the Battle of Sailor's Creek. And bear in mind, his army has now been merged with General Yule's Home Guard Corps, right?
Right.
So the Confederate Army is the very briefly lived, and I suspect a number of the listeners might not even know about this, but the very briefly lived Confederate Fourth Corps has been reabsorbed, and now it's back to 3 Confederate Corps, and Ewell's Reserve Corps, and the Cavalry Corps under Fitzhugh Lee. What's left of all of these forces, the reserves under the Home Guard under Ewell, and it's all a mishmash of troops, take a drubbing at Sailor's Creek. This is the Black Day. This is where Lee famously says, "My God, has the army dissolved?"
Yeah. He
Um,
supposedly grabbed the Confederate flag and was riding up and down the line with it.
yes. And uh, but then what you have next is men just falling out of the ranks. Right? And it's impossible to estimate how many of these men do so. But we have firsthand accounts of Confederates talking about seeing, a couple of artillerymen there from the Washington Artillery, or was Washington Artillery still alive at this point? Terrible. I shouldn't have been a specific one, but this or that or the other. And the general consensus was these men had done their service. They weren't cowards. They weren't shirking. They had decided that they had enough. And for a lot of them, the priority now is I need to get home and protect my family.
So
Um,
let's shift gears here. I want to
but
something.
let me, sorry, I know I'm being long-winded, but just to finish up the question, this is where it
Okay.
gets tricky. That's okay. I'm taking too long to answer the question. When we get to Appomattox, this is where it gets really tricky because when Lee launches his famous April 9th attack, at least think it's famous, only around 8,000 actually turn up for the assault, right?
Right.
Like for the overlap, but not even the assault between Gordon's attack and Longstreet's defense on, I think it was Clover Ridge. It's only about 8,000, right? But when Lee surrenders, among other things, under the agreement that the men will be paroled, they need, drum roll please, 28,000 parole papers.
Right.
So something doesn't add up here. Now, the surrender was in and around the area of Appomattox. I forget the exact circumference. But a lot of the men seem to have either turned around and came back for their parole papers or basically said, I'm not going to fight anymore, but hey, if we're here to surrender, great. There were Confederate officers who excoriated the men of their regiment, asking, where were you yesterday? Why weren't you with us? But what's interesting is it depends what number we go with. If we go with the number of men that turned out, then General Grant had 10 men to 1, and Lee's glorious 8,000 were outnumbered by 120,000 godforsaken Yankees. But if we then go with the parole numbers, well, Lee has about 28,000 and Grant has about 60,000 on hand. Another 60,000 are coming up. Technically, Lee has the regular ratio of effectives at Appomattox. The difference is they've been pursued for a week by the federal cavalry, which has denied them rest, denied them resupply. They were supposed to be resupplied at
Amelia Courthouse.
thank you. Starts the name, Amelia Courthouse. And of course, they send the ammunition. At Farmville, they actually do get food, but Sheridan quickly drives them out of Farmville, aptly named. They're exhausted. Right. So it's 28,000, but they're not necessarily effective. So that's where the number gets really, really, really messed up. And that's why it's even harder than normal to actually answer the real question of numbers. That being said, I think Veron makes a really compelling case. And I'm compelled to agree with her, though we do have to acknowledge that the condition of the army here is more important than its actual number of effectives. But in terms of in ratio, it's the 2-to-1 ratio.
All right, so
Yeah.
I want to come back to that guerrilla warfare for a minute. But first, I want to ask you this: we did some touch on Davis and his government. They load up on trains. They can only go so fast because they're afraid, the rails are going to break. Where are they headed? What's going through their mind? I mean, I know they go to Danville, but did they think they was going to be able to hold up at Danville, or?
Oh, I've got a story for you. If you want this story, my recommendation, my favorite account of the collapse of the Confederate government that I've been able to find so far, because it's an interest of mine that I haven't really pursued as much as I've intended to. I got distracted by a video game and someone shaking keys, I'm sure, but usual things I get distracted by, or whiskey. But I'm kidding. Basil W. Duke, like the perfect Confederate name. Brigadier General Basil W. Duke. That's his name, I swear. He was a Confederate brigadier, and he was, I think, the highest ranking Confederate officer who was present the night that Davis's government essentially collapsed. And he gives us some really interesting insight into what happened. So at that point, originally they were going to get to Danville, but Danville was very obviously going to fall next. So they were instead on their way to Greensboro, North Carolina, which is where they held their last, I think it was Greensboro, their last cabinet meetings. This is where Johnston is going to report to Davis that Sherman is offering them terms of surrender that are so generous that it's frankly comical. And it's the only time in the entire war where Davis actually does agree to surrender. It doesn't work out because the conditions that Sherman was offering were A, completely ridiculous, and B, ultra vires, if I'm pronouncing that right, way out of his zone of control as a general.
Well, see, what I read is they had got a wire that Johnston had surrendered to Sherman, and one of the cabinet members wadded it up and said it's falling apart.
That would have been after. So, well, let me finish this story and then I'll get into that story because as I'm sure you already know, but and as many of your listeners probably already know, General Johnston actually surrendered to Sherman twice.
Right.
Yeah, April the 21st and April the 26th, the memory serves. Um, it took 2 times to make it really sink, and I imagine that would have been a reference to the second surrender, because the first surrender was actually authorized by Davis at Greensboro. Um, so what Davis would tell Duke, and Duke and his cavalry, I can't get over that name, Basil W. Duke. I mean, you need to get more Southern. Um, but Duke and his cavalry were really only there at that point as a military escort in the hopes of getting Davis to Mexico, which they saw as their final duty. Davis, very cavalierly, would say to Duke, he said to him that, I'm paraphrasing, but essentially that his plan was to take Duke's cavalry and what Confederate forces they could scrounge, and they would head to Texas, presumably to merge with Kirby Smith, whose army was still operating in that area. There, Davis said, they would form a nucleus of 3,000 or 4,000 or so, whatever we could get, of the most dedicated Confederates. And then what he would call this, when this malaise of spirit, that is to say, when this brief period of unnecessary pessimism passes, and the Southern people realize that we can still win the war, we will rally the Confederacy in Texas, we will defeat the invading federal forces, and we will retake the Confederacy. I mean, it's nuts. It's Hitler in the bunker ordering phantom divisions to fight the entire Red Army.
That's exactly what it sounds like.
It very much so. It's very much what's that wonderful line from Downfall? When Hitler's demanding to know if Steiner will attack, and then finally Krebs tells him it is very unlikely, or tells someone it is very unlikely that Steiner's division can fight the entire Red Army. It's very similar mentality, and Duke plays the role of Krebs here and essentially tells Davis, "Look, we're here to guard you, but we're not entertaining any illusion about this war going on. We lost."
Now, I had read that in the book April 1865. I don't know if you ever read it.
No, I think I watched the documentary based on it. It was really good, but I haven't read the book.
According to this book, and I've never been able to source it, they said the last Confederate capital, the cabinet already broke up, but the last Confederate capital was actually at Fort Irwin, Georgia.
Really? Okay, I'm not aware of that, but if that's what the book says, I'm not going to challenge it.
Yeah, the book claims that that's where they said that the last Confederate capital was at Fort Irwin, Georgia.
I thought it was Greensboro. But that would make sense.
Well, as they was retreating, it named the capitals. It said Danville, Greensboro, and then it said the last one was at Fort Irwin. I've never been able to source it, but that's funny.
I'm going to look that up because that's fascinating. If it's in the book and it's peer reviewed, I'm not going to challenge it. But that's interesting. I mean, the Confederate, the cabinet falls apart piecemeal, right? Like, right. Heck, Judah P. Benjamin, he never even officially resigns. He just disappears one night and he pops up in England, right? It's like, I'm going home. Good luck, guys. But because he was a British subject, right? So he could just head off and he'd be set. Like it sort of just falls apart, right? As the cabinet members each realize this is over and Davis is insane. Davis himself would admit later on in life that his hopes of a Confederate perestroika if I'm using that term right, which I'm not, I guess Renaissance in Texas was quote overly sanguine. Which, I would say so.
So, all right, so let's go back here to Appomattox that day.
Sure.
Lee's fixing to go meet Grant, and suddenly he stopped, and they say, "We think we found a way out." So he postponed the meet.
Yeah.
He was looking for every possible way to keep his army on the move.
Because he has to satisfy the code of honor. If there's any opportunity for success, it has to be explored. He can only surrender with explicit permission from the civilian government, or if he's in a position that is categorically hopeless and further resistance will in no way aid the war machine of the Confederacy and will only result in the useless effusion of blood. That is the only context that Lee can surrender in.
See, I know that Porter Alexander suggested to him. But I believe that momentarily, even though he ended up weighing out, momentarily he did give thought to taking to the hills.
Maybe. But it's I don't think it's a strategy the Confederacy could have pursued, right? And I mean, maybe he thought about it because he's desperate, and desperate when you're desperate, you think of everything, right?
Yeah,
But
you'll do anything.
as he put it, besides I am too old for bushwhacking. And there's also as he pointed out, what he pointed out really, which is guerrilla warfare would have condemned at least the area of operations, which would have been Virginia, to potentially decades of partisan war. And what the Confederate guerrillas had demonstrated out west is that the partisans were the occasional headache for the Federals, but they were a nightmare for the Confederate citizen they pretended to protect. Because once you give into partisan warfare, you can do whatever the heck you want.
Now, what was it? Was it the day before, or one of the days when Grant was trying to, get him to surrender, and Lee handed the letter to Longstreet, and he wadded it up and said, "Not yet."
Not yet. Yeah, that was the 8th, I believe. So what happens basically is after the Battle of Sailor's Creek, Grant's going to write to Lee and say, paraphrasing, but this was after yesterday's events, you must agree that your situation is now hopeless. And I wish to lay out the terms I will offer for surrender, essentially like that, right? Or propose that we meet. And that's, if I recall, that's when Longstreet, I mean, he whispers because he couldn't really speak beyond a whisper. But he says, not yet. And what's interesting is Lee is going to respond, and Lee is going to essentially say that he is open to communication, to discussion. Grant follows up on this, but what Lee's saying is he basically writes, I'd be interested in so Grant responds and says, yeah, basically we can discuss surrender of your army. And Lee responds, I am referring to discussing the conciliation between our two nations. And
Yes.
basically Lee is trying to maneuver Grant into agreeing to talk about a negotiated settlement, which is frankly the height of arrogance. And that's also why after the attack on the 9th, Lee, from what I know at least, was genuinely concerned Grant would not offer generous terms anymore because Lee had, frankly, so inappropriately attempted to misdirect the conversation.
I mean, for all at that point, Lee knew he knew he might have been hung.
Mhm.
I mean, he could have made it last stand at Appomattox Courthouse.
Could have. And that's also what Longstreet said when Lee was unsure, something to the effect of, because Lee was very reluctant to go, and Longstreet said something to the effect of, look, go talk to him, see what terms he has to offer. If they're not good enough, come back and we'll greet him warmly.
What?
We'll greet them warmly. So basically go, if it doesn't work out, if the terms are unacceptable, come on back and we'll fight it out. And knowing that Grant was almost certainly going to offer, because remember, it tends to get overlooked. Armistead and Hancock is the famous best friendship of the Civil War. They were actually just acquaintances. They really weren't that close. Longstreet and Grant actually were very close friends.
Have you ever heard, speaking of, just kind of get off something, have you ever heard that Armistead had a thing for Hancock's wife?
I have no idea if that's true or not, but the thing is, Hancock's wife was like considered drop dead gorgeous. So was Hancock. Like it really was just watching two beautiful people produce beautiful children. So honestly, I think pretty much everybody who met Elmira Hancock had a thing for Elmira Hancock.
When Lee went in and he, finishes signing the documents of surrender, and he walks out on the porch and hits his hand into his fist 3 times. What's he thinking?
Probably pissed off that he lost. I mean, I don't know, but
is he thinking, what might have been, if this would have happened here, or if this would have happened there?
I mean, he doesn't give us a lot of clues, and I'd have to read more primary sources to really be able to say with absolute confidence. But from what I know, one of the few times he ever spoke candidly about it was the New York Herald interviewed Grant and Lee on separate occasions after in 66, I think, a year after the war. And Lee was likely, as he did, played it close to the chest. This is where Lee would famously, and I think, giving an asinine response when he's asked who was the general that caught that you were the most afraid of in the war, and he responds General McClellan, which to me is just pettiness, because obviously the answer should be Grant, and he just doesn't want to admit Grant because he doesn't want to admit that
Well, see,
Grant
I
beat
also
him.
think the same thing when Grant says about General Johnston.
Oh, well, he never, I don't remember him ever saying that he was afraid of Johnston. He said, what he said about General Johnston was that Johnston's strategy, he felt offered the Confederacy the greatest, well, not long term, but the greatest short term survival, and also guaranteed his defeat, which I
Well,
totally agree with. But just to finish that, because that question you asked me, um, when what Lee goes on to what Lee at one point says cryptically, the South never was all in this war. And when the war began, I can't remember when he said if it was what correspondence this was in, but he talked about how essentially all of the South needed to be ready to endure a brutal war. And for
10
me, what
years
I
in the
infer
last
from
10
that
years.
what I infer from that is he's angry about the fact that there were so many Southerners who were still selling cotton illegally to Europe, that there were so many enslavers more concerned about keeping their enslaved than actually providing them to the Confederacy for military labor, that there are so many men who avoided conscription. I think to an extent what he felt was you guys invited. I don't like to use the word total war because I think that's overused, but you guys invited uh, a war that was going to be massive and desperate and deadly, and you never really committed to it. And if you had, maybe we would have won. But again, I'm just speculating.
What, what bothers me, well, I don't want to say it bothers me, but it's kind of like a double standard thing. I listen to Americans who are, patriotic by all means. And when you start talking about um, what Sherman did, Southerners get all up in arms. But then when you consider what we did at Dresden, killing 45,000 people in one night for really no reason, they're all for that. If you understand what I'm getting with that, I mean, you can't really have it both ways.
Uh, no. I mean, you're sorry. You're talking. I had to respond to a quick message. You're talking about how they talk about Sherman's campaign of directed severity versus like strategic bombing World War II, right?
Yeah, like in Dresden, they killed 45,000 people in one night in a firebombing.
I thought it was 20. Was it 45?
It was 45, and it was not even a military target. And this was in February of 45.
Oh yeah, no, it was. I mean, I'm familiar with the bombing at Dresden. And I mean, Dresden was so horrible that that was really what kind of began to end the bombing campaigns in Europe, because it got to the point that it was becoming embarrassing. Um, but I mean, yeah, no, I think the hypocrisy absolutely is there. I mean, speaking for myself, I know it's easy for me to say, and it's dismissive of me to say, but I'm sorry Sherman burned the farm down. Sucks, man. Um, would you rather fight another Gettysburg? Sherman's campaign materially contributed to the end of the war, directly causing the fewest casualties of any campaign of the Civil War. Um, you can build a farm back, but if your kid is killed, they're not coming back.
Well, I
Uh,
mean, a lot of
and
Sherman stuff.
Sherman's men tended to target enslavers. So I mean, like, sorry, you owned people. What am I supposed
I,
to do? Cry for you? You didn't build
but
that house.
I've read his orders. He never actually ordered what some of the stuff that happened. Some of
Nope.
the troops got out of hand, but
Yep.
it wasn't like the numbers. I mean, they talked about the raping. I think there was 8 soldiers that was charged with rape.
Yeah, and that one's tricky. That's one I'm not going to comment on because the scholarship is changing on that, because frankly, when we talk about sex crimes, it often reflects our own regressive, because like I don't want to my some listeners might get upset about me getting a bit woke here, so to speak, but um, we live in a very sexually violent culture, and that
Oh, of
reflects in our
course.
historiography. And that the Me Too movement has begun to change that, and I think we can expect the historiography of women and sexual violence to change very dramatically in the next few years. I frankly, yeah, 8 soldiers were charged with rape. I I want to believe that that is the limit of it. I think it'd be very naive to actually believe that. And I know
You think there
they're
was
already.
more? You think there were
Oh,
more rapes that took
absolutely.
place?
Oh, of course, of course. I mean, you're moving 60,000 men through the country with very, very little oversight of their behavior. They're angry. They are free to do mostly as they please, short of outright murder. And they're frustrated. They haven't seen their homes, their wives. I mean, rape and war go hand in hand. It's something that we often don't talk about in these conversations because it's fun to do the armchair general thing like we're doing right now and, you know, call balls and strikes or whatever you want to say, passes and touchdowns. But sexual
There was
violence goes hand in hand with warfare. It
there
always
was a
has.
chant in the army of rape, kill, pillage, plunder.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. Um, so I'd love to believe there were so few. I don't believe that for a second. And I also don't feel qualified to comment on it beyond that because I haven't done the research. I haven't read the appropriate material. And to be perfectly honest, there are new books on it. I've been a bit too scared to read them because I know they're going to be devastating. So eventually I'll work my way up to it. But
And you know what I've
that's
seen
something
a
I can't
lot
comment on.
with our my northern and southerner friends is, you know, when the southerners will, you know, call out this happened, this happened. I've seen a lot of northerners try to downplay it. And you know, again, I don't know what extent, how bad it was, but try to minimize what actually took place during the march.
I mean, I think there's a counter swing historically because the Sherman's March has been so exaggerated by the Lost Cause and Confederate apologists. Um, Important to remember that, you know, the histories, popular history would tell you all of Atlanta was burned, which is remarkable considering it's remarkable how much antebellum architecture you can see there today, right? It was all burned except all of this. It was actually more like 30 to 40%. Which is a lot. I mean, that's devastating. Like
I
I
mean,
live
the
in
Hood
a
though that
wonderful
burned it,
little.
right?
Sorry.
Wasn't it Hood that actually burned it?
Um, I no Atlanta. That was Sherman ordered it.
Okay,
Very
somebody was trying to
explicitly.
tell me that the other day, and I said, "Well, I don't know. Let me go find out.
Not
I've
that I'm
never
aware
heard."
of. I mean, like the thing is, you're gonna have fires started by retreating armies that are gonna intermix with it, like Charleston, for example. There's all kinds of theories what was started it. Part of it was inevitably the Confederates burning bales of cotton on a windy night. Great idea. Oh yeah. Let's take the most flammable thing in the world that's also very light and let's light it on fire when it's windy and see what happens, right? So, I have no doubt that Confederates lighting fire to provisions that they were unable to carry certainly contributed to it. But no, Sherman very much directly ordered that that the public works of Atlanta and all other resources relevant to the Confederate war effort should be destroyed.
So
He made no bones about it.
Lee goes after the war. Lee goes back, and he's in Richmond. Um, Rumor has it that um, Colonel Mosby slips behind lines, goes to where Lee's living at, and asks for orders: give up or fight on. And Lee says to give up. If Lee had wanted to, could he not have convinced the Confederate soldiers to continue the fight in the hills?
I mean, yeah, but I think he recognized how terrible an idea that was, and this just brings us back to the guerrilla warfare issue, and that is, you know, there's Davis's very famous speech after Richmond falls, where he says probably the funniest thing he ever said in the war, which is, freed from the responsibility of defending our cities, our armies can now move freely. Like, wow, that's a great way to spin it, dude. Freed from the burdens of having lines of communication, supplies, or bases of operations, our army can now exist unburdened by the very essentials that we need for war. Great, man. You know what would really help? Why don't they throw their muskets away too? They can march faster, right? Like it's hilarious. But I don't think that's a call for guerrilla warfare. And there's a wonderful
Now, I
essay
heard
about this in
that
the collection, The Fall of the Confederacy, and that's where I'm cribbing this from, just to give credit for it. This isn't my original idea, but if you look at, first off, the wording, what Davis really seems to be saying is, hey, now that we don't have to defend Richmond, Lee can do whatever he wants, and the guy's a wizard, right? And it's quite hilarious, because it's failing to take into account the fact that you need a base of operations and you need lines of supply just to function.
Right.
But the real problem, and Donald Stoker points this out as well in his phenomenal book, The Grand Design. But to get back to the essay, the point it makes, I wish I could remember the author, it's a wonderful essay, is if you look at the history of the Confederacy and partisan warfare, it's not a healthy one. By 1862, the Confederate partisans had essentially just stopped taking orders, and the Confederate Congress realized they had no way of controlling them. Case in point, Colonel Quantrill?
Oh yeah.
He was a captain. He
Really.
wanted to be promoted to colonel. He was never promoted. He just said, "Yeah, screw you. I'm a colonel now." He was not a colonel. He was a captain. But the partisans didn't care. What was it? Governor Joe Brown of Georgia would say, "God hath no fury like a company of Confederate cavalry." The Confederate partisans wreaked hell on earth for the citizens they were pretending to protect. And when Richmond would tell them to stand down, they didn't listen. The Confederate partisans never contributed anything, but this is mostly in the far west. John Singleton Mosby is an exception. Mosby did cooperate with Lee very, very effectively. But partisans like Bloody Bill Anderson and William Clark Quantrill, they didn't cooperate with any operation. They did what the hell they wanted. They were out of control. And remember that the Confederate Rebellion, and I'm going to be blunt about this, the Confederate Rebellion was ultimately a rebellion that was a counter-revolutionary rebellion in order to maintain the structural hierarchy, the superstructure, if you will, of the southern states, right? The strict ruling class of the slave-owning aristocrats over a subclass of free of white non-slave owning yeomen and a limited number of an emerging middle industrial class, and below them a further underclass of the free enslaved and the extreme poverty of the Confederacy, who essentially lost their status. Victoria Bynum writes about this in Unruly Women. And then below them, a subclass of enslaved serfs, right? That is the structural hierarchy of the Confederacy. And that's what they're fighting to maintain. Ultimately, if you lose slavery, you lose that structural hierarchy. That's what they're afraid of.
Well, let me ask you a question.
Let me wrap this up though. So, guerrilla warfare threatens all of that, because if you can't exercise direct control over your partisan warriors, then you cannot maintain the status quo that I've just described. And if you can't maintain that status quo, what are you fighting for? So if the Confederates actually appeal to guerrilla warfare, they are giving up all of the control the government has, and it's just going to be pure anarchy. And that cannot result in the establishment of an independent Confederate States which recognizes the existing ruling class that brought them to war. It's therefore completely out of the interest of the ruling class to advocate for partisan warfare. So you're surrendering in your efforts to continue to fight. And even Davis, as desperate as he was to continue, he never actively advocates for an anarchic partisan war. Even when I referred to, remember the story of Basil W. Duke, and he talks about forming a nucleus in Texas, even then, he's talking about a nucleus of 3,000 to 4,000 loyal Confederate soldiers. He says nothing about guerrilla warfare and nothing about partisanship. Now, I think the mistake is we assume it's the Vietnamization of America. But in Vietnam, the Viet Cong are under the direct command of Ho Chi Minh. Right? And Ho Chi Minh was able to exercise control over his Viet Cong soldiers in Vietnam. That is not the case for the Confederacy and their partisan, quote unquote, warriors in the far West, who, as I said, basically stopped taking orders by 1862. So it doesn't make any sense in regards to Confederate war aims for the Confederacy to actually appeal to guerrilla warfare. I don't think that was ever the plan.
That is actually pretty much, almost the answer I gave and given to people when I've heard them say, they should have used the Fabian strategy like Washington. And what I've tried to explain is, look, there was no center of power. The British had no center of power like the Union did, and the Confederacy could, move. The Washington could move at will. those are apples and oranges comparison when you talk about the American Revolution
Yeah.
and the United States. You had to have a center of power for the Confederacy.
Hmm.
It just there was not one there. I said, so that's an apples and oranges
Yeah.
comparison. But
No,
anyway,
I think that's a great point. And just to add to that, center of power, I love that. I think you hit the nail on the head there. And a center of power that's actually being obeyed, because if this is no
um,
longer being obeyed, the war cause is lost.
so I asked this question in the Annabelle group the other night, and only 80% of them it flew over their head because they immediately started going, well, it wasn't about slavery and blah blah blah. But here's the question I asked: Is it fair to say that at the beginning of the war, the South was fighting to keep slavery?
Yes.
In the North, not at first, but I guess 1863, the North was fighting to free slavery. But
Not at
by
the
the
beginning of
end,
the war. Not at the
well,
beginning of
no,
the war, no.
no, but by 1863, they were fighting for
Yeah.
freeing the slaves.
The two
By,
become indissoluble. Union and abolition are the same thing by 64. They kind of merge as the war goes on.
by the end of the war of April 1865, the South was no longer fighting to reverse slavery. They were fighting to preserve their nation.
I don't agree with
While,
that.
well, think about it. There was no, there was no slaves. Where were they going to get the slaves back at? All the
Oh, they
plantations.
plenty of slaves. Remember that as the Union Army is advancing, you have massive numbers of enslavers fleeing to the deep South with their slaves. The last of the enslaved are not formally freed until the famous June 19th, 1865, when General Granger issues his orders. And that's of course just in the Confederacy. Obviously, the slaves in Union states won't be freed until the ratification of the 13th Amendment. But even then, there were enslaved in the Confederacy, a former Confederacy, a year after the war, who were still enslaved because the federal government had not physically reached them. So no, there was still plenty of slavery. I imagine if the Confederates in 65, I don't know, let's say Basil W. Heisenberg invents the Confederate nuke, and they just, magically win the war. Originally, the Confederate Constitution said that the slave trade remained illegal. This was in large part to appeal to the bellwether southern states, which had a significant human trafficking market. I suspect they would have probably repealed that and reopened the slave trade. But if you want to look at their dedication to it, look at like the Kenner Mission. So the Kenner Mission is often cited by neo-Confederates to argue that the South's no longer fighting for slavery. But the Kenner Mission itself is as close as the Confederates ever get to offering any kind of emancipation in return for British support. It's in March of 65, which is a little late. And it was never authorized by Confederate Congress. It was a secret mission under Davis. So even if the minister plenipotentiary, he wasn't even a plenipotentiary, even if he had been welcomed, and even if the agreement was reached, which it wouldn't have been, because at this point the British had no interest in supporting the Confederacy because they had lost all of their ports. The nation had been bisected. Even if Kenner had reached some agreement, it wouldn't even have been a legal agreement for ratification because he wasn't sent by Congress. This is how reluctant they were to offer emancipation in 1865. James Mason was instructed by Davis to offer a gradual Confederate emancipation in return. This was, I think, in February, in return for British recognition. And Mason couldn't bring himself to even offer it. He just kind of says in vague terms, if there is any outstanding issue, which is, I'm paraphrasing, which is an obstacle to your recognition, we would rectify it. He doesn't even say it. As for Confederate nationalism, I don't think there was any Confederate nationalism. It takes a long time to form nationalistic interest. If you look at what Confederate soldiers are writing, their interests are far more regional or really far more personal than that. I think the Confederacy, one of its biggest weaknesses was just holding itself together. I don't see a lot of evidence that Confederates saw themselves as part of an actual nation building project, so much as in a reactionary uprising against the threat of abolition.
Let me ask you this, and this legend has it from what I've read. I don't know how true it is that there were, in April of what was it, March, April, no, March when they put the first couple black units together.
Yeah.
Legend has it they were engaged at Sailor's Creek. Have you ever heard that?
No, I'd be very surprised. Maybe, but I'd be very surprised. My understanding is they never saw any action at all. And by God, why would they at that point? They were organized in Richmond. Richmond has fallen. They would have to be absolutely insane to fight for the Confederacy at that point. And it's important to note that those two companies, most of them were enslaved at the Traeger Iron Works, who were basically told, you have no choice. These were not men who were interested in fighting for the Confederacy for their freedom. They're not stupid. They know their freedom's coming any day now.
All my lost causer friends will say I'm crazy for saying this, but I believe Jefferson Davis and the Confederate government made the right decision by never arming the slaves. Because would you have liked to have been the two guys who walked on the plantation with 100 slaves and said, "Okay, here we're going to teach you how to shoot"?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. It was never really an option for the Confederacy to do it. And that's why it was such an act of desperation. What's amazing is when they finally began to toy with the legislation, they didn't even want to guarantee the freedom of the enslaved who fought
Right.
for them. It was really a case of, oh no, you'll fight to support your own slavery, right? Delusional, totally delusional. Lee is the one who basically says, look, if they're going to fight for us, you're going to have to guarantee their freedom. Otherwise, it's not happening. But even then, even that's completely out to lunch.
Now, I read this article and I forgot which scholarly article it was, and it said they estimated there was 6 to 10,000 blacks that fought for the Confederacy. Now, is this light-skinned men that could pass off as a white man that were fighting for their own economic interests? Because I just cannot see a full, African descent man being allowed in the Confederate Army.
I know there's a really controversial paper, like it's like titled like Afro Virginians and Afro, which has been largely dismissed. I'd have to see the paper. Ken Levine has recently written a book, Searching for Black Confederates, where he pretty much pursues every single rumor, theory, conspiracy, and pretty much proves every one of them is not true. 6 to 10,000. First off, I don't think any scholar could actually find 10,000 examples of, like you were saying, a white passing black soldier. Could you have had a couple of men in the Confederate ranks who, under the generally accepted slave codes, would have been considered to be a black man on the basis of 1/8 blood? Yeah, probably. They might not even have known themselves. But that's a real stretch. 6 to 10,000. No, that's no. I feel very comfortable dismissing that out of hand.
What about Forrest men, the ones slaves that supposedly rode with him?
Well, when does he say that?
I don't know. I've read that there was.
No, I can tell you.
Oh, by all means, tell me.
He says it in his testimony to the Committee on the Conduct of Reconstruction. And what was he doing famously early after the war?
He joined the formed the Klan.
Well, he didn't form it technically, but he
sorry,
made it the thing. Yeah, it's easy to think of as the founder because he basically, it wasn't his idea, but he's definitely the man who made it popular. That's not a good look when there is credible evidence that you committed war crimes at Fort Pillow. Right. So he's saying, oh yeah, there were black men riding with me and we treated them like brothers. Sure you did. Sure, Nathan. Funny you didn't mention this until now. It probably because you don't want to fall astride of the Civil Rights Act passed by Grant, and the Klan Act, which is basically America's first anti-terrorist laws. Now, when you look at that story, you have to ask yourself, when are they saying this? And when he's saying it is precisely when it would give him cover. There's no evidence, as far as I know, of any of these phantom black soldiers with Forrest until he needs them to exist.
Yeah, we need to do a show on this one night about Forrest, the myths and legends. Because I've heard so much stuff about him. I think that'd be an interesting one.
Yeah, I'd have to do more background research. I don't protest to be this is one of the things I know about Forrest because I'm curious about that too. I'd have to do some more background research. I mean, honestly, I'm not a fan of Forrest.
I'm not a how do I put it? I'm not a Forrest idolist. I don't think he was the greatest, military man ever. I think he was an amazing figure. Um, in the fact, to rise to be a millionaire or a colonel to a general. I think he was a fascinating man, in not in many different regards, but I think he had, of course, many bad sides to him. But Forrest, I'm not one of the Southerners who think that Nathan Bedford Forrest. I get the argument with people so many times when
Yeah.
they talk about Forrest as a cavalryman, and I'm always like Jeb. There's three letters, Jeb.
Yeah. My response is Grierson.
Grierson.
Uh,
You're exactly
Be,
right.
Be,
Grierson.
Benjamin Grierson leads his raid in Vicksburg in 63 is, I think, on almost any metric more impressive than anything Forrest did. The entire raid is 100% in enemy country. A lot of Forrest's most shall we say cavalier adventures are in friendly territory, not Grierson. Grierson makes a massive ride, does extraordinary damage, gets like what, an entire Confederate division on his tail. Eat your heart out, Forrest. No, yeah, my response is Benjamin Grierson. The musician who hated horses, who was naturally put in the cavalry.
I think he did. I mean, I still will give him credit for, maybe it was just blind luck. I mean, but what he did at Bryce's Crossroads was pretty impressive.
Oh yeah, no,
Um,
Forrest had a nose for tactics, but I'm not going to give him the gold star for best cavalry for that.
oh, absolutely not. I mean, no, I'm not going to give the best. I
Yeah,
mean, to me, he was more of a raider. Um,
yeah, yeah. He
yeah.
was good at it. He was definitely very good at it. I mean, hell, Sherman saying, "We'll empty the treasury to get this guy." He was very good at it. I just think
Well,
that we tend to ignore people like Grierson because, again, we pigeonhole our understanding of these historical events. And one of the pigeonholes is the Confederate Cavalier was the dashing Superman. It doesn't fit the narrative when, again, some gangly bandmaster who got kicked by a horse as a kid and hates them turns out to be an amazing cavalryman in blue. That doesn't fit the narrative.
and what is so amazing, or I love talking this to you, so many people on each side, they have so much venom, and you can't sit there and have a logical conversation about the military men without just this venom coming through, and they're biased.
Yeah.
You have the ability to look at them as what they were, and how good they were, and and their faults. That's
Well,
why I
thanks.
can. Well, I can rarely talk. One of the things I hate most of the time is hearing how bad Grant was,
Yeah.
and then the other side how bad Lee was. It's like, look, let's just admit they were two of the greatest commanders to ever come out of West Point. Um,
Well, they're both fantastic. I mean, I
yeah,
think Grant was superior, for reasons we've gone over before, but no, they're both incredible.
yeah, and I mean, and you hear people, all the time. Well, Lee was lucky; he was inferior opponent. Well, okay, well, what about Grant then? You can't have it both ways. I mean, that they were better generals than what they was facing. And
Mhm.
Grant, you understand. And people, I hate hearing them say, "Well, Grant won because he had overwhelming resources." Okay, fine. He knew that he had to apply those overwhelming resources, and if he continued to apply it, he would wear them down till there was nothing left.
Oh, well, actually, I mean, to an extent, I mean, I personally don't go in for the attrition warfare narrative. I think attrition warfare was the strategy in 1864, but that wasn't Grant's strategy. It was Lee's strategy, and it was the right choice to make. But to anyone who poses that, I'll just pose the simple question. Take a quick survey of Civil War battles from 1863 to 64.
Mhm.
And then I'm going to give you two options. You can have 120,000 men and you have to take those trenches that have been prepared for 3 days, or you have 60,000 men and you have to defend them. Anyone who would choose to be the attacker has absolutely no idea what Civil War combat looked like.
Oh yeah,
There you
oh
go.
yeah, absolutely.
So where's your empowering manpower? Theoretically, if we take the old Napoleonic axiom, and this is before the rifle musket is the standard arm, right? Rifles were the exception, not the rule in the Napoleonic era. Although they had far more concentrated artillery. But Napoleon's aphorism was you needed a 3-to-1 advantage in terms of manpower to assure a tactical attack on a prepared defensive position. Grant has a 2-to-1 manpower advantage if he can bring the totality to bear. So I personally, I dismissed the manpower advantage. The Union had a manpower advantage that it desperately needed. And that's to say nothing about a number of Confederate advantages concerning manpower. One, the Confederates have the enslaved. There's an entire corps, unofficially, of enslaved following Lee's army, and they're doing
Right,
all the rear guard tasks that free up
right.
men or to combat. Union doesn't
It's
have that. Every time the Union
exactly.
deploys 10,000 men for the Army of the Potomac, take them right out of the fight. They're not involved, right? Second, as the Union drives forward, they have to now protect, they have to garrison cities, they have to maintain lines of supply. They're losing entire divisions having to protect these points. The
Exactly.
Confederates are retreating into reinforcement. Lee has 65,000 men at Gettysburg. At Petersburg, he starts the campaign with 90,000. That's after his losses in the Overland Campaign because he's falling back into reinforcement. Whereas the Federals are losing men as they advance. Um, and of course, the Confederacy has the advantage of being able to fight on the defensive if it so chooses, in large part because the Federals must conquer the Confederacy. The Confederacy has to conquer anybody. They just have to
They
not
just have to
die.
outlast. Yeah, they have to
Um,
outlast.
so with all those considerations taken in, I think it's bloody amazing the Union won with a 2-1 advantage. Yeah, I would hope for at least a 3-1 advantage in that context. They
Well, do
never
you
had that.
agree with Shelby Foote that the North fought with one hand tied behind their back?
I'm going to quote David W. Blight to respond. Bullshit, Shelby.
Okay.
That's not true at all. Both sides had shirkers. Both sides had men who avoided service. The Union was desperately calling up troops. They had two massive de-enlistment crises in 63 and 64. Uh, no, they were not fighting the war with one hand tied behind their back. Both sides were giving it their all. The difference is the Union had a far better managed economy, and I will say this, a Union advantage the Confederates don't have. For all the defensive advantages, it is bloody helpful for the Union that they actually had a navy. And on top of that, their territory was not, for the most part, the theater of operations, which meant the Union economy could prosper and thrive, which certainly gives the appearance of not as many material sacrifices in the Confederacy. But to say that they weren't giving it their all, no.
What is, I've heard, different sides about Shelby. What is your opinion about Shelby? I don't think he's the lost cause or some make him out to be, but I think there is some lost cause in him.
Oh, he's a lost causer insofar as that's what he was raised in, that's what he was reared in, and he never questioned it. Um, I don't think he's some, cross-burning Klansman.
No,
I mean, I read his Civil War narratives. I never actually finished part three. By the time I got to part three, I'd read Battle Cry of Freedom, and I was like, okay, I get it.
I mean, he
I
made a
think I,
statement that how the
yeah,
blacks were treated after the Civil War was just as bad as what
yeah,
how they treated them, what they did to them.
which is nonsense. But I mean, Shelby
Well,
Foote.
they abandoned these people, okay, and did nothing to you know just left them.
Well, there were efforts, the Freedmen's Bureau, the Klan Act, the Civil Rights
So
Act. Ultimately, what happened is the Republican Party, the conservative faction, was able to, and the liberal faction was able to betray the radical faction. I mean, it's not to get too political, but it's the usual pattern of ignoring what leftists say and then pretending like someone didn't warn you. But I mean, sorry to get really political there, but the left was 100% on the right side of the Civil War.
I mean, Shelby
Um,
was a great storyteller.
Oh, amazing. And I mean, it's hard not to be charmed by him. Now, I've known some people who just hate him and hate God for making him. I can't bring myself to do that. He was such an integral part of my early fascination with the war, and his narratives are lovely. I mean, if you're gonna read his narratives, you're gonna pick one. I don't know. If I could go back in time, I'd read Bruce Catton instead of Shelby Foote. Better researched, more historically accurate. But nah, I don't go in for the Shelby Foote hate. The guy has done so much to spread interest in the Civil War, and I don't think for a second he had any malicious intent. He was ignorant about certain things, but a lot of people are. His product. I don't like the term "product of his time." I really don't like that because that's very often used as a pass to protect people in power, and to protect a lot of
Well,
whitewash a lot of cruelty.
some
But
of that,
Shelby Foote is a product of his time, and
but
I
some of that, I disagree with you probably other times because like my grandmother, she was the sweetest little lady you'd ever meet. She's
Mhm.
almost 100 years old, and when she would go somewhere and she come back and she was talking about her nurse, and she said, "Well, that was the sweetest little N word nigger." That
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pull that. I didn't mean to say that out loud.
Yeah.
I meant to cut it off. I'll have to edit that. But she said,
Not
"You know,
not a word I'm very fond of, to be honest.
yeah," and I don't, I never say that. That's why I
Yeah.
didn't say any word, and then
So
you
it's all
just
it's all it's all it's all good. It's certainly a word I'd
so
prefer to avoid going forward, but it's
yes,
all
yeah.
good.
Oh, I do too. I try to never. So please forgive me. I was
No,
not
it's
meaning
all
to
good.
say,
It's all good.
but she would say that, and and I would just cringe. But she absolutely felt nothing of it. She thought she was being
Yeah.
that's just all she knew. And he was like,
Yeah.
you can't say that.
And
I was talking to. Let me tell you this right here. I was talking to a guy the other day who I was interviewing, and he's a young Republican, and he was talking this to me, and he said, talking about his last opponent, who or the guy he worked for, who was a campaign manager. He goes, "Well, there's a difference between a black person and an N word."
okay, at
And
that point they can F right off.
well,
Um,
I let Wade say. I finished listening to him, and I
yeah,
said, and I finished listening to him. I said, you're running for you're wanting to be a state senator?" I said, "You just said that to me."
yeah.
I said, "You
It's a
don't
white
know who
supremacist.
Adam's house cat. You don't know me from Adam's house cat, and you're going to refer to black people that way that you're going to be representing in the state."
Yeah.
I said, I don't have anything else
No.
to say as far as this conversation.
And I think a lot of people they give themselves a pass on that. I mean, first off, when it comes to that N word, I'm increasingly convinced unless you're in an educational context and you're teaching literature which uses that.
Exactly.
But even history, I don't think it's a pass. If you're teaching history, look, you don't need to say the N word. We all know how appalling the racism was in that period. And when you do that, if you have black students, you're not like what you're doing is you're basically telling all your white students, look at your black students, and it makes it that's really uncomfortable. And if you really feel you need to say that horrible word in order to make an impact, I'm sorry, that's not more important than the comfort and security of your students of color. So
I agree with you
for me,
totally.
there's, it's just, I, I just don't that word.
Because I can say the N
Um,
word and get the same effect over as if you say
it's
the
totally
the,
unnecessary. Yeah,
the full
we
word.
we
And
know how horrible it is. It's totally unnecessary. We don't. Yeah, exactly. As for a young person saying that, if you're talking to someone who's like 90, I mean, they're not going to change. They're in their golden years. Like it is what it is.
and
But if
I said
any young person like my age saying it, no, they're just an inveterate racist and not worthy of any consideration. None. They have nothing to say of value. They have nothing to contribute. And they either have to grow as a person, or and until then they can be dismissed. And if you think distinguishing between N words versus good black people, no, you're just a racist. And,
that
and I'm sorry, you don't get to
that's
decide.
exactly
Yeah,
that reminded me of what I used to hear 60-year-old people say 30 years ago. There's good black people, and then there's
yeah,
that, and there's no, you're just a flat out racist. I mean,
yeah,
there's there's good. That's like saying there's good white people and there's bad. There's good
yeah.
and bad in every race, but you
And
can't judge somebody on the basis of their skin or their sexuality or
and
their
the very notion that the kindly, sagacious white man gets to decide which of black people are good and which are not, that's plantation mentality. That's the exact mentality which justified slavery.
like I
So
don't
just
refer.
get out
I
with it.
won't get when I'm talking about somebody's gay. I only refer to them as gay or homosexual. I'm not going to use any type of
Yeah, yeah,
nasty language
yeah.
like that. I just don't. My parents didn't raise me in an environment like that. In rural Alabama, I never heard them say words like that.
Good on them.
Yeah, they never brought that around. I mean, never did. Um, you
Yeah.
um,
But it's something
and
we have to challenge and confront. Like I'm really glad that you confronted that racist you were interviewing, because you do. Yeah, you have to. I think one of the problems that we face when it comes to these issues, we're way off Appomattox at this point, I should mention, but one of the issues we really face on that issue, this was pointed out to me in grad school, and I thought it was a tremendous point, is that we've sort of again pigeonholed racists are bad people. Well, no one thinks of themselves as bad. We can be self-critical, but very few people actually say, I am a bad person. Like, you might say that in passing, like, oh, I did this, that was bad. But very few people actually wake up and say, I am a horrible person, and genuinely believe that. So if racists are bad people, you're not a bad person, so you're not racist. Maybe you said something racist, but you're really not racist. And that is the problem, because it basically makes it impossible for people to actually confront their own racism. So you
That's what
have
bothers
to
me
call
with
it out.
so many Confederates, such, people, and I'm an unapologized Confederate sympathizer. Also know what the war is fought over, but the people who I've seen that are Confederate sympathizers, for the most part, 90% of them are racist.
Yes.
I mean, no
And
doubt
I
about
mean,
it.
yeah, I don't know. It's God, I think it's kind of late to eve to. That's a rabbit hole. I don't know if to be honest, even at this time of night, I've got the stamina for. But I mean, I would be curious if you recognize that the cause of the Confederacy was slavery. Where does the nascent support come from? Because to me, that's like
Oh,
that's pretty
okay.
much a deal breaker. Like at that
I
point,
understand that,
it's
and to paraphrase, Shelby Foote on that, um, I would always have to stand with Alabama. I just couldn't imagine fighting against my state.
but what about the Alabamians who fought for the Union?
Um, I mean, I guess I don't know. I can't really
every
say.
every Confederate state had South Carolina has a battalion, but every Confederate state had Union regiments, and that's before black enlistment.
Well, see,
South versus the
it's like
South,
this right here.
400 in the
I
South
couldn't
versus the
imagine.
South. Sorry,
I I couldn't imagine being, I think it was 25%, just 75, but the 25% of the Kentuckians that went to fight for the South. I couldn't imagine leaving Kentucky in the Union to go fight for the Confederacy. John C.
yeah,
Breckinridge, vice president from Kentucky. I could not see leaving my home state of Kentucky and going siding with the Confederacy.
yeah. Um, or John Bell Hood. Thank goodness he fought for the Confederates. If he fought for the Union, the South might have won. But
I think John Bell Hood is. I don't think he's as bad as people make him out.
he was, in the words of E.P. Alexander, and again I'm paraphrasing here at it secondhand, but he said something along the lines of General Hood was an extraordinary brigade commander, an excellent division commander, mediocre corps commander, and a terrible army commander.
Well, see, I
Uh
think I'm of the opinion on, and hear me on this, that yes, it was a disaster putting him in the Army of Tennessee, but they
yes.
put him in that position to fight,
Yep.
and fight he did.
Yep.
Um,
Which was really stupid. And Hood, I think Earl J. Hess makes a really good argument in the Battle of Peachtree Creek that Hood was genuinely shocked to have the command and he wasn't politicking for it. But it doesn't change the fact that he kept writing to Davis saying, "Hey, we should be attacking," which was stupid advice, and then he had to follow through with it.
think
No
about how
matter
many
how you
times he
slice
came
it, it was a
close, though.
terrible idea. Huh?
I mean, think about how many. I mean, in war like this right here, it's sometimes a matter of minutes. If Peachtree Creek, if they had attacked instead of waiting 8 hours, he could have annihilated half the army.
Maybe. I don't know enough about the Battle of Peachtree Creek to comment intelligently on it, so I don't know. But
Yeah.
all I can say is when he did attack, it didn't work. And I mean, at the end of the day,
And remember what he was basing his attacks on, who he had learned from, Jackson and
yeah,
Lee.
for sure.
But he was
But he wasn't Jackson or Lee, was he?
not. No, he
I
was
mean,
not
I know I'm
Jackson.
being harsh, but ultimately
Yeah,
the
no, I
outcomes are
understand
more
that. I
important than anything
mean,
else.
yeah, and I know people who, yeah, I understand that, but something tells me now. I don't care what people say that he was not that his wounds didn't affect him. You can't tell me when a man loses his leg and his arm's useless that doesn't affect them in some way.
Oh yeah, it certainly did. Although I mean, again, I'm not going to pretend to be a Hood expert. I know Riley Sword writes some interesting thing. I think it was Riley Sword, yeah, in the Confederacy's Last Hurrah, Spring Hill, Franklin, and Nashville, which he frames at many points through a kind of pseudo biography of the dual biography of General Cleburne and General Hood. It's a good book. Um, I think part of that, yeah. I think there was a certain, from what Riley Sword describes in his book, there was a certain insecurity by his injuries, a desperation to prove his continued manliness. He also wanted Sarah, I can't remember her name right now, but her nickname was Buck, but I remember it probably after this conversation. He wanted her to fall in love with him, and she just wasn't doing that. And he seems to have gotten his head that some kind of grand victory to win her over. So there's a desperation there too. I think there's also a sense of what we would call today imposter syndrome, because he really shouldn't have been elevated to the command. And like you were saying, it was on the promise of an offensive, so he had to deliver. But deep down, he kind of knew he couldn't do it. I'm just speculating here. But as for the actual injury, this is really interesting. Actually, I was just thinking with the other day. The prevailing myth is that he was using laudanum, and which would explain a lot of his decisions, especially at Franklin, if his mind was clouded by inebriates of that nature. But his great grandson actually researched the issue, very impressively, phenomenal research, and he tracked down the original source of information on the laudanum. And what he found is it was in a 1926 biography of Hood and had no citation at all. The author just invented it. And if you track the citations, any book that says Hood was using laudanum and has a citation, if you track it, you go to the book they're citing it from, and then you go to the book that book cited it from, and you follow the links, you will get back to the 1926 biography, which has no accreditation to that statement. It's just made boldly. Where it gets more interesting is he then examined the personal papers, which of course he has access to because it's family papers, and General Hood's doctor, the name escapes me right now. He noted that the general was very resilient and had stopped taking laudanum surprisingly early after his injury. And there's no records of any appropriations for laudanum for Hood after that point, which means, as his great grandson very proudly stated, that the evidence is pretty thorough that Hood was not taking laudanum during the campaign in Tennessee. And he was very proud of that. America is very, very drug averse and has a very anxious relationship with narcotics. So, hey, I've proven my great grandfather was not a drug addict. To which I respond, you have, and the research was phenomenal. Now you're stuck with the fact that he was totally sober when he was conducting himself so idiotically, people thought he was on drugs.
Do you believe that, though, that he took no laudanum? It's just hard for me to believe.
It's hard for me to believe, too, because what he was doing was insane. But it turns out the evidence says very categorically he was sober. So,
but to be up under that kind of pain,
tough guy, had something to prove.
I mean, because I said, that when this was going on, he was riding up to 20 miles a day in the saddle.
Yep. And this is the circumstantial evidence used by those who've argued the case. The problem is, as historians, we have to look for evidence, and there is no as far as I know, there has, after this study was concluded, there is no contemporaneous evidence that confirms he was using laudanum. Some people are just tough, and Hood was a tough guy. But to me, speaking just personally off the cuff, if my great grandfather was Hood, I wouldn't have been proud of this. I'd be devastated because I'd rather think he was on drugs. Because you know what? The brain power might be hereditary. So I personally would have not been happy with that outcome. I congratulate his great grandson on extraordinary research, phenomenal work, absolutely proved his case, and I'm happy that he's happy with the conclusion. Speaking for me, I'd have preferred him to have been high than to have been that foolish, because he still conducted a campaign which very credibly could be assumed to be one inspired by narcotics.
Do you think, and I'm sorry, we'll have to have a Hood conversation one day, that at Franklin, he was so angry after what happened at Spring Hill that he intentionally punished his army?
I don't know if he punished them. I think he was desperate to recapture a missed opportunity, but I don't consider myself an authority on the issue, but that's my sense of it. I mean, McPherson puts it very hauntingly in Battle Cry of Freedom. Because he makes the argument that Hood believed that the Army of Tennessee, esprit de corps, was weak, and the way to fix this was to teach them in the school of Robert E. Lee of relentless attacking, which is unbelievably dismissive and arrogant, considering the Army of Tennessee fought the Battle of Shiloh and fought Chickamauga and Perryville. Like, no, these guys know how to attack. And as McPherson put it, if that's the case, at least, that General Hood had simultaneously proven the Army of Tennessee could make such an assault and had rendered it incapable of ever doing so again. Personally, having read Bradley Sword's work, I think it had as much to do with just desperation. He knew he had missed the opportunity of a lifetime at Spring Hill. And what do we do when we miss an opportunity? We sweatily chase after it. And my gut feeling about it is he, thought, okay, I missed the bus, but maybe if I run really fast, I can catch up to it. I think it's desperation to seize upon the opportunity of a lifetime, which was too late.
Okay, so we got to do. Got me thinking that we've got to do this one night about the movie.
Yeah, that'd be fun. Would have to be on a holiday because it's a long one. But yeah, that could be really fun. That could be pretty funny.
And what would you just give commentary about different parts of it, or
I mean, but what do you want to do? I just sit down, watch the whole thing, and just jam around about it. Why not? I've always thought it'd be fun to do a commentary. For all three people that then want to, I'm kidding, of course, but I'm always very self-deprecating on that kind of thing. But yeah, you want to post that. I mean, technically, if you post that, as long as you're not actually using the video itself or any audio from the film, it's just us talking, there's no copyright violation. So
yeah, I didn't
if
plan on doing
somebody
that.
was insane enough to actually want to, they could just synchronize it with the film and just listen and watch.
Yeah,
If someone's crazy enough to want to do that,
and just watch it. Because I mean, there's so many. I mean, oh my God, there's so many.
it's a fun movie to talk about.
And you
It's a
know
fun
what?
movie to talk about.
One part I want to take back. Do you remember when um, they were breaking and they're running, they're on the way back
Yeah.
to the gate, and Lee is looking through his glasses and he takes him down, and you can just see the fire in his belly. I mean, he
Mm-hmm.
smelled blood in the water. I mean, God,
Yep.
Martin Sheen
Kills it.
nailed it.
Yep.
And
His
go ahead.
just his portrayal of Lee, and this is I think where you just see this is just funny because it's such a divisive issue for people like us who are nutty enough to love these movies, or maybe one of them. Oh, no. Uh-oh. I guess we'll cut it there. Yeah, save it for hey, we're still recording. I don't know. Last time we were. Save it for some other conversation. But yeah, Duvall versus Sheen on Robert E. Lee. Definitely prefer Sheen's performance. Maybe not technically as historically accurate, shot for shot, but as a there you go. You're back. Actually, I should probably get going too. It's really getting late.
Um, when he hit that, and and I still use this right here a lot with my because I got pissed off in the Alabama group because these people keep putting up these stupid fucking lost cause memes, and I have a rule about I don't care if you put up a meme, but they were just flooding the board, and I said, yeah, I made a post about this the other day. Perhaps you did not. Perhaps you misunderstood my orders. Perhaps I did not make myself clear. Well, sir, this
Oh,
was
that's
made
funny.
very clear.
That's funny.
I,
Honestly, it's and then I really gotta get going. It's just getting late, and I'm running low on batteries at this point. But it reminds me of back when I used to post more regularly on your Civil War page, the Killer Angels, and that neo-Confederate. I think I remember his name because it was such a, again, perfect Southern name, Daniel McCarroll. Yeah, you knew I was going to talk about him. And ultimately, in our like little posting war, the reason why he would always win, or he's, and this is why I didn't really care, because inevitably why a lost causer is going to win is because a lost causer's post doesn't require any thinking. It's just copy paste. Just take some nonsense you found online, hit copy, hit paste, congratulate yourself. And he would post, I actually stopped following the page for a while because he would like flood it with 15, 20 posts a day of just copy paste from some Sons of Confederate Veterans website. And that's really the difference between someone who falls in love with the myths of history versus someone who actually wants to learn it. Learning history is a lot tougher than finding a couple of romantic stories and then just memorizing them.
Do you know what caused me to finally eject him?
What was it?
he really did, he really didn't break any rules for the most part.
Mhm.
Um, he did put the lost cause shit up there, but he wasn't breaking the rules.
Very annoying though.
Very annoying. But every one of the moderators wanted me to eject him.
Yeah.
It was 11-1, and and they were always going back and forth at it, going back and forth at it. And I've got a rule about no black Confederates.
Yeah.
And then he posted about black Confederates, and I said, of all the people out there that had your back, you go out there and you just said, fuck me. Of
Yeah.
all the people, the only
Yeah.
person I said that could eject you, and you did
Yeah.
that to me.
Because you have to remember that folks like him have an agenda, which is why I don't enjoy talking with them. The agenda is they have, I mean, I'm not going to attempt to, speculate as to why they do this, but they have a historical view of things where the facts really don't matter. The only facts that matter are the ones that validate them, or validate their opinions, like, at least. And they're not interested in having a conversation. They're not interested in following rules either. They are there because they are in this. They have an axe to grind with people like me. Um, and honestly, expecting folks like that to follow the rules or to have an intelligent conversation is just, it's not going to happen because that's not what they're there for. Um, which is why, as I said, I pretty much have just a zero tolerance policy. If someone isn't interested in discussing the facts with the best information they have, and that doesn't mean, not making mistakes. I make mistakes all the time. But they don't have an interest in actually learning, then there is absolutely fundamentally no point in having that conversation or expecting them to change. It's a total and complete waste of time. And the best thing you can do is to tell them to do that somewhere else. It's a free country. They have a right to sit on the, they have a right to stand on the sidewalk screaming at passerbys and trying to sell pencils in their cup. They can totally do that. It doesn't mean I have to invite them to my house to do it. It doesn't mean I have to discuss the value of their pencils with them. It doesn't mean I have to discuss any of their delusions with them. And I, I
And that,
think I think we have to start getting, just as a culture, we have to start getting a little harder with people who are not interested in having intelligent conversations and just want to be validated. Because it's dangerous at a certain point, that kind of miseducation. You can't stop people from doing that, but you don't have to give them a platform. You don't have to validate them. You don't have to show them any intellectual respect. They can scream whatever they want, but it doesn't mean they get to do it here.
I posted it the other day that was going on, and I love talking about it. I said, okay, post me one after action report of a Confederate officer praising his black troops.
Yeah, like literally anything, just like any evidence. I am gonna go after this because I'm really,
Okay, buddy, I'm
I'm
sorry
tired,
talking to you.
but I will end off with a joke that I'm very fond of. So Lee and Grant are at Appomattox and they're at their tables, and Eli Parker has written the final draft in his immaculate handwriting. And Lee and Grant have signed it, and Lee makes his post-signing request concerning horses. Of course, I think that's the people listening to this probably are well versed enough to know that request. And Grant responds that there's no system in our army for men having their own horses, but I won't change the terms, but I will instruct my officers to allow any man who claims to own a horse to keep it. And then Lee says, I have one more favor to ask, General. I hope you will hide any and all evidence of the 50,000 black soldiers currently under my command.
Yeah.
Because that is the most reasonable explanation I've ever heard. Uh,
Oh my God.
and with that, I really got to go. It was a pleasure as always. Before I go, I mentioned to my friends I was chatting with before I came here that you recorded these, and they were very curious about it. I don't know why they want to listen to me talk about the Civil War when I'm not with them. I do it enough when I am with them, but they were curious. So could you send me the link for your channel again?
Yeah. I'll actually what I'll do is I'll send you the link to the one we did last week.
Yeah,
I think
sure.
that was the best one. Hey, and
That was a good one.
ask them to subscribe too.
Yeah, I'll float it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't. I'm
'Cause,
I'm not a. Sorry.
I said, yeah, because everyone I get, like, I'm up to 540 now, and every subscriber I get means more and more people will get to see it, and
There you go.
to continue to grow. So yeah, ask them if they don't mind to subscribe, because we'll have many more out there. And
Now, if you start making money on our videos, you got to cut me in, yeah.
oh yeah, of course you'd get a cut on it.
Anyway,
You know how many I don't know if you ever listened to any of me and Lucas Wilder's interviews, but do you know how many subscribers he has?
I don't remember. I think it's a robust number. He's a wonderful channel.
Oh my god, dude, I love conversations with him.
Yeah.
50,000.
Yeah, sounds about right. I'm one of them. I love his stuff.
Yeah, he's the best.
Yeah, he's
But okay,
fantastic.
I'll send that. If you had a chance to listen to that one yet that we did?
Yeah, I listened to some portions of it. I thought it was good. I really
Yeah.
enjoyed it.
Okay. All right, buddy. I'll send it over to you in just a minute.
See you later.
All right.